The Honourable Clayton Cosgrave.
Look, I follow colleagues, Mr Macleay and my parliamentary colleague Leanne Dalzell in supporting this bill. I think it's probably one of these pieces of legislation where there isn't a lot of argument. I agree with Mr Macleay that our respective officers and most of the colleagues, I think, would be inundated by people who went into transactions, whether it was to buy a washing machine or whatever, in second-hand or new, in good faith, because there was a time, of course, in New Zealand when deals were done on handshakes and consumers paid the debt on time, and those who sold the goods to the consumer, if they broke down, would go and repair them and sort it out, and you didn't need a vast amount of legislation like this. Sadly, those times have changed. And I think what both parties to a transaction seek ultimately, both the consumer and the seller, if you will, is openness, transparency and accountability in essence. So the good or service does what it says it's going to do, it performs. If it doesn't, it's remedied, and people can get redress. And I think I recall, I know it's slightly off the edge, sir, but I'm sure you'll indulge me briefly. I recall my time in government when we dealt with, reasonably controversially, the real estate agents sector. And before I sort of start getting phone calls and emails and death threats, like all sectors, including politics, one bad politician, we're all a pack of so-and-sos. You're judged by the lowest common denominator. Many good people in that industry were judged by those in the industry who bluntly ripped consumers off. And it's an interesting example, actually, I think, which is germane to this, whereby an industry, and I believe industries can self-regulate when they do it right better than governments can, actually. That's my own personal view from a commercial background. But where that industry was given a number of opportunities to actually provide, to reform itself, provide accountability, transparency and openness, whereby consumers were dealt with fairly, and when people behaved inappropriately in the industry, consumers could get redress and accountability. When that industry had railed against that for years, rejected it, then at that point public pressure built to a point where the government I was a part of, had to step in. And I don't think we want to get to that point. I think that the place is littered with the metaphorical bodies of people who were done over by sharks in that industry, and there was very little in the end that we could do retrospectively about that. So I think this legislation is good in that we move forward, and it is sad that we have to put in regulation what was the old sort of Kiwi handshake. Our times have changed, sadly. Technology has changed, and people act, some, very few, but some act in nefarious ways. The other point I want to make in respect to this legislation is it is also necessary, I think, because, and I mean no disrespect to the communities when I say this, we do have a difficulty, I think, with sort of basic financial literacy, and that many folks do not have the confidence to be able to weave their way through the provisions, certainly of legislation like this. Some of us struggle, who aren't lawyers, struggle each day with it. But knowing their rights, knowing that they can execute those rights, and knowing what their responsibilities, also business folk knowing what their responsibilities are. And our financial literacy is such, and it's a passion of mine, that I think we have to do something serious about that, so that people do have better financial literacy and do have more confidence when they're dealing with, whether it be the flash transaction or whether it be sorting out your credit card arrangements, or knowing what it means if you are going to get into debt, knowing what the implications are of an HP, because as a country we do like spending money, and knowing the ramifications of debt and hire purchase and those sorts of things, and knowing what you can do to protect yourself so that you're not ripped off. I think that's ambulance right at the top of the cliff stuff, to give people confidence when they're entering into even basic transactions, as I say, like putting a fridge on HP, knowing what the ramifications of that are, and knowing they have some redress. This brings us into line, of course, substantially with Australia, given Australia is one of our biggest market, and one of our biggest markets, and also our closest neighbour in terms of the commerciality, let alone the culture. This is a good and sound piece of legislation. I would note in passing Leanne Dalzell's point that this has sat around for a while. there's a couple of inches of dust on it over the years, but and I think it should have been put up in I think one of the colleagues over there said there's a 120-point action plan that the National Party has. I think this should have been up there in the sort of, the upper part of the 120 points. I'd love to see them. If they want to send me the whole 120 points, it'd be a cracker to read. It'd be a cracker to read over the cocoa tonight and go through. But this is important legislation. There are some people who yawn at this sort of stuff. They're generally, as I say, those who have a high degree of financial experience, those who have a certain amount of resource behind them where they can get independent advice and can get the confidence to engage in these transactions. But for the vast majority of our community, this is a serious deal when you're spending money, and consumer protection has to be paramount in this. We need to look further, I think, perhaps, because there are, perhaps at our banking industry, perhaps at those who provide finance to consumers, given that there's two sides to it. We need to increase our financial literacy, but people also, of course, have a responsibility if they get into debt to pay that, to meet their obligations in terms of payments. However, there's also, I think, a counter obligation that the provider of that debt finance has got to actually be very open and transparent about the interest rates and the penalties and all those sorts of things. I think there are a number of issues dealt with in here in terms of the consumer, but I think we actually have to have a look at maybe the banks a bit bigger, some of the bigger issues, especially around credit cards and a few things like that perhaps, where it's not an issue of saying somebody is bad for non-disclosure or for disclosing in a certain way called fine print. It's more about saying, okay, we've got to educate people, but we've also got to ensure that those providing, for instance, finance are very, very open about the ramifications of providing that finance and the responsibility you take on when you go into debt. So we support this piece of legislation. We think it is good. There will need to be, I think, a fair bit of work once it's implemented around marketing it to people and assisting, for instance, business folk. We've just done a tax bill, now this thing. These are good measures, but of course for the small business especially, it's another thing they've got to read, another hour in the day. They've got to come to grips with the requirements on this, and for every hour they're spending doing the work of the Crown, if you will, it's, as I said in the last bill, it's another hour that they're not spending behind the counter, growing the business, selling the product so they can employ more people, etc., etc., etc. So I think the government needs to commit to providing a fair bit of resource around assisting both consumers to come to grips with their new protections and rights, but also to assist those business people to make it easier for them, sir, to implement and comply, because most, if not nearly all, will, with the requirements and responsibilities within this legislation. So it is nice in the first week of Parliament that we deal with some bipartisan, if you will, legislation. I'm sure we'll get to the gritty stuff in the next few weeks, but this is an important bill. It isn't something that a certain commentator should yawn at. I'm sure it won't get the high media profile that other sort of more colourful times in the Parliament have, but it should, and it is a very, very important piece of legislation. I wasn't part of the committee when this was dealt with, but I commend the committee for their work, and we look forward to its passage and scrutiny through the parliamentary process.
Call Kevin Haig.